So let me ask you the question, even though this is your interview. Why are you Christian then? That means if there's such clarity in the Hebrew Bible of what the Messiah is supposed to do, I hope you don't mind me asking you this, because I always am mesmerized by Unitarians who I admire so much because they show such willingness to be ostracized, so why not apply that rigorous methodology and go, the Christologies that we find in the Christian Bible are very different than what we find Tanakh about the Messianic age.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I am here with Rabbi Tovia Singer. He probably needs no introduction, but just in case he does, Rabbi, do you mind explaining a little bit about your sort of biography and how you came to be sort of a prominent YouTube and internet personality and came into sort of your role as sort of in counter apologetics and that sort of thing?
Sure. I'm an Orthodox rabbi and live in Jerusalem, and I'm very grateful to join you here on this broadcast. My work is devoted to countering fundamentalist evangelical, all of them are Trinitarian, Christians who are dedicated to converting the Jews to Christianity. And, groups like Jews for Jesus and Chosen People Ministries, these are all Protestant denominations, use all kinds of passages and verses and texts and proof texts. And many of their questions are very good. They're very important questions that need to be addressed, that must be addressed. And there is a very large audience of folks who really want to see these ideas, addressed. So I've very much devoted my life to answering these questions in a way that's thoughtful and makes sense. So it's very exciting to be with you.
Yeah, well, I thank you very much for your time and thank you for coming on my program. So for anyone who is unaware of me, I'm a biblical Unitarian Christian. So I kind of find myself a little bit in between probably the evangelical Trinitarians and yourself. And when I'm watching either debates between you and someone like William Lane Craig, or watching sort of response videos back and forth like that, it's like sometimes I'm being tugged in one direction and sometimes I'm being tugged in the other direction. And so I think that one of the main focuses I wanted to do for the first part of this interview is that I thought I would play something like the Trinitarian's advocate and ask you some questions about common proof texts or arguments from the Hebrew scriptures that Trinitarians will give to try and bolster a Trinitarian understanding of God. And so just in case the audience misunderstands, I'll be doing my best to sort of put on that persona and take that point of view, even though I'm kind of mostly probably going to agree with what Rabbi Singer has to say. But before I got into those questions, I just sort of wanted to ask you just kind of a brief general question. What is the Jewish Orthodox understanding of God, the oneness of God, and why is that so important, and where does that come from?
That's a really good question. The last part of that question is the easiest to address, and that is it comes from the Bible. It comes from scriptures. And Unitarians, and I'm using that word as with a lowercase u. There are a number of Christian denominations that are Unitarians, including Unitarians, who believe in the absolute oneness of God and recognize correctly that the doctrine of the Trinity went through enormous developments over time, and it's not found in the Hebrew Bible, and it's also opposed in the Christian Bible. However, as things would move in the 2nd and 3rd century, you could see what direction the church was going in to somehow deify Jesus. And it went through many, many developments Ignatius, Tertullian, who coined the word Trinity, Origen, probably the church's greatest thinker. He had ideas that would not be considered orthodox, but how to solve these issues, how you can have one God, but yet Jesus would be God as well. And ultimately, in 312, Constantine converts to Christianity in the late fall, and he realizes that the split in the church over the exact nature of Jesus was not acceptable. He needed a unified church with a unified doctrine, and ultimately convenes the Council of Nicaea, where this dispute is all voted on, and the doctrine of the Trinity is becomes the official orthodoxy. There's still churches are going to go through a back and forth on this, but in 381 in Constantinople, Theodosius, the last emperor of Rome, who presided over the East and the West, reaffirms this and clarifies this at the Council of Constantinople. The Nicene Creed emerges from that. So what I think is important for the viewers to understand is that this is all naked. This is all transparent. This is all man-made. But you and I are not interested in what is man-made. We're really interested in what is God's opinion? Like, what does God think? What does the Bible say? And it is inconceivable that salvation and a relationship with God is only accessible to people who have fancy degrees like you or I have. That's just not possible. And I say that because I know many pastors personally who are Trinitarians, and they tell me straight away that 95% of their parishioners do not understand the doctrine of the Trinity. And I know that's correct because of how they seek to defend it. They don't really even understand it. So it's inconceivable that a simple peasant in the western part of the Russian Empire that cannot have access by just reading simple texts of who is the God who she is worshiping. It's just not possible. It can't be that she has to understand what the hypostatic union is and these persons as distinct. It's just inconceivable. Well, Tanakh is very clear. It's very transparent. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Now, that word one is a noun, one. And moreover, Tanakh is very clear. The Hebrew Bible is very clear that there is no one else, that God is alone. Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6, Ata hu Hashem levadecha, you alone are Lord. I mean, what could be simpler than that? Isaiah 45, verse 5, I am the Lord and there is no other. There's just nothing else. Ve'efes kamoni, in the next chapter, Isaiah 46, verse 9. I remember lecturing at Duke University years ago, and they have a Methodist divinity school there, and I had the opportunity to speak to their young, bright students, and I asked them, if you were God and you wanted to convey to mankind that there's one God and there's nothing else. There's just one God and there's nothing besides him. He is the beginning, he's the end. There's nothing else besides him. What would you put in your Bible? And they thought about it. They found that an intriguing question. And each student would come up with something they would put in to forever dissuade any reader that there could be anything but one God, a absolute Unitarian view of God, that he's one alone. And when they came up with ideas, I put their ideas up on the blackboard behind me. I just wrote down what they thought they would put in if they were God and wanted to forever convey to humanity that to. And when I saw that I was pretty much done with ideas, I then, using the same chalk, next to every statement, I put a verse. It means, like, there's nothing God could do to convey more clearly and more transparently that there's one God and one God alone, and there is nothing else besides him, and only he is worthy of worship. We may only pray to him. Our knees can only bend to him. And in Jewish thought, the absolute unity of God is critical to understanding his nature. This is very important. So many people view the Unitarian view, the view of the Torah is that you have to get the number right. It's one and not 3 or 6 or anything else. Just know it's one. But there's something much deeper there. And I think we also intuit that if you believe that there's more than one God, it doesn't really matter if you believe there are 3 or 8. It really just doesn't matter anymore. So if you believe there's more than one God, then it really doesn't matter anymore. So there's something, it's not just a number difference. There's something happens when you leave an absolute Unitarian view of God, that there's one God and he alone is God and there's no other. And this is what it is. It's really quite delightful and deeply moving. You see, if there's one God, it means he's all powerful. He has all the features of God. He's all powerful. He's uncreated. He's all knowing. He's immutable. All these are features of God. And we can then know something about him that's critical, and that is that there's nothing you or I have that he doesn't possess. There's nothing you can do or I can do to improve God's existence. So when he came to creating the universe, and man is the culmination of creation, God didn't create the world for palm trees or frogs or chickens. He created for mankind. He created man out of a complete act of love, altruistic love, because there's nothing we can give him that he doesn't possess. If there's one God, that means that God must be all love to a level that we can never hope to attain. That means the absolute oneness of God tells us about his nature and character, that he must be all merciful, he must be all love, and we're called upon in the Bible to Kadoshim Tiyu, Ki Kodesh Ani Hashem Elokecha. Be holy because the Lord your God is holy, and he's merciful. You should be merciful. We can never hope to love the Almighty, blessed be his name, as much as he loves us. That's not possible. Just like you or I can't I can never hope to love my mother. She should be well as much as she loves me. And that's my mother, right? So therefore, we are very much in control of the relationship. It's counterintuitive because God's love is infinite. Moreover, he created the world out of a complete act of kindliness because he's one. If there's multiple agencies, so it could be different. But if there isn't, there's only one, that means he has no needs. That means he's all loving. And there's one thing I want to sort of preempt, and that is, there's one thing to be very careful about. I want to just lay this out. So Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, repeatedly emphasizes that there's one alone, there's no one else besides me, there's nothing like me. Look, if you're watching us right now and you have any question about this, just read Isaiah 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48. If you read those chapters, it's impossible. And they're easy to read. This is not like, trying to read other chapters of Isaiah, which are a little difficult. I teach Isaiah, so some of them, these are easy. It's just absolute radical monotheism, which is exploding. And Isaiah is just heading off there is one thing be aware of in that, and this is rather inconvenient. In the Bible, when a messenger of God is speaking, an angel, a prophet, he can be called God in the Bible. Moses, in Exodus 7, verse 1, after making a case to God why he's not worthy to lead the children of Israel out, God, I can't even speak. God said, you'll be God to Pharaoh. And so be careful, because Trinitarians, in their desperation, and they're not evil people, they're just taught as children that they're going to go to hell if they don't believe in Trinity, and that you will be disfellowshipped out of your Southern Baptist church if you question the doctrine of Trinity. And if you are yeah, absolutely. If you are in a Southern Baptist church and tell your pastor, I don't think I believe in God anymore, your pastor, unless he's in 95% of the cases, will put his arm around you, will smile, come into my office, let's have lunch, and will not give up on you.
Right. Or if you say, I'm having doubts about, did Jesus really raise from the dead or something like that, you'll
All you
get that
want.
same kind pastoral
Yeah,
treatment.
very
I've been
thoughtful.
excommunicated 3 times
Right.
for not
Right.
believing in the church.
So why now? It's clearly I want to just make this case. We understand what a Unitarian, whether it's a Unitarian Christian or a Unitarian Jew, the church hates us in a sense. Hates meaning they're very threatened by us. Because first of all, Unitarians not only generally like Jews, just for you to know, generally speaking. So Unitarians, Christadelphians. The J Witnesses are Unitarians too, but they're kind of a weird cult. I know I'm going to get in trouble with that, but they are. I have nothing to say about it. But they are. But they reject the Trinity very forcefully. But they're just a millenarian cult that came up at the end of the 19th century, just an odd group. But it's a straight cult. Right. So the case I want to make, which is easy to do, is that the church is much more threatened by questioning the doctrine of the Trinity than questioning belief in God at all, or because you're saying the emperor has no clothes. And that's why they flip out about this, and they will weaponize passages. As I said, that means we do not use the same conventional language as Tanakh, so therefore we would never refer to an angel as God. We just wouldn't talk the way an angel's a created being, and then there's God. But in Tanakh, if someone is speaking in the name of God, and it's not God, but it's an angel, so the church, they're in an unenviable predicament. They will go, that shows. Well, it doesn't. So be very I just encourage you, the viewers, to be very aware of that. But Tanakh doesn't let go of this, because the moment you question the absolute unity of God, then your relationship with the Father becomes distant. It's not as intimate. Why? Because there's something in between. God is limited in some way. And in the Trinitarian scheme, the Father is the monarch. He's really inaccessible, So, I mean, much more so, and that creates a problem. So that's why the Jewish people utterly reject the doctrine of Trinity. And that's the main issue. It's not the statues in a Catholic church. They don't really worship those statues. I mean, some do, but that's not the issue. People, there's statues. There's no statues in my Protestant church. The big issue is that they worship Jesus as God, and they worship the Holy Spirit as a distinct person from the Father, which emerged from the Father in Orthodox theology, capital O, or Father and Son, the filioque in Roman Catholic. It's all insane. So that's what Jews believe. The oneness of God is intimately connected to God's nature. He must be all love if he alone is God, and there's no distinct person in the God. What if I may, because I'm just thinking of these now, I apologize.
Keep going. This is
I want to warn you, the viewer, of something, and that is that Trinitarians use ridiculous, unconventional language to explain the Trinity. And as I said, most of them are really well-meaning people. But when someone uses a term like person, stop them. Don't let them say that's unconventional. And you can say, how many people are in the bank? I'm on the phone. Well, I see there's someone behind the counter, a teller. There's one guy's got a gun. I guess he's a guard. So I said, there's 3 people because I see there's a person there. Okay, don't let them use terms like person because they're using the word which otherwise would be conventional. He's a nice person, but they're not using it that way. So when you hear hypostatic union, whoever you're talking to say, I need you to replace these words because they're unconventional with conventional language. And the church hides behind this unconventional language as a fig leaf to hide its sin. So just in talking to a Trinitarian, you're going to get crazy language. And they rely on that. That's what they hide behind. Again, most of these people are not Machiavellian. They're not in on it. This is just how they're taught in the seminary.
Yeah, I agree with that. Or the Trinitarians will use conventional language, allowing you to smuggle in a lot of your assumptions. Like like if I say the word person, like every human being has a whole list of, connections and meanings to that word. But then they allow you to smuggle that, but then they kind of, will sometimes play a shell game underneath that, or with being, or with the word God. Like, to really track what Trinitarians are saying, you have to understand that they have 2 or 3 or 4 definitions of each of these words, and that you really have to be careful which definition is being used when. And it can be something like, tracking, which shell is the cup, which cup has the shell in it now, and that sort of thing. And this mix of novel vocabulary and standard vocabulary that's used in an unstandard way is a lot of what's going on. And let's see, I just had a couple thoughts, like what you were saying with respect to history. Like, one of the main specializations of my channel is I go through pretty much every church father in sequence and talk about what they believed with respect to God and Jesus and or the Trinity, but also about other things. And what you said about the footsteps or the breadcrumbs of the development of this doctrine in history just being transparent for everyone to see is very true. You can see the steps, but it's not like it was also a straight process either. There was all sorts of side paths and eddies and all sorts of things. But the development of the doctrine of the Trinity is perfectly transparent to look at if you're historically curious. And we have access to plenty of sources that really illuminate it with pretty strong clarity. And even what you were saying about Constantine, even Constantine at the Council of Nicaea calls God the Father the one true God, and the Son the second God, who is clearly subordinate to and obedient to the first God, and uses those words, first God and second God. And so even at the Council of Nicaea, it wasn't the doctrine of the Trinity as most people imagine it and try and believe in it now. It still took many decades, or in some cases a century or more, to be the form of the doctrine that people recognize. And what you said about Christians having, like you said, and we kind of interacted on this already, there are so many subjects where if you're having doubts or questions, your pastor, the elders at your church, or a spiritual mentor or something will be very kind and patient with you if you're trying to work these things out. And that's great. That's exactly what they should be doing. But the doctrine of the Trinity is one of those things where they might be kind at first, but until they feel like you're actually coming at it from a place of very strong information and conviction, then all of a sudden you'll see a nasty side that can be lurking within Trinitarian churches that's really hard to, reconcile with what you previously thought those institutions were. And it can be very hard and difficult.
Right. And Calvin murdered, he ran Geneva like a police state. Calvin was the second generation of reformers, and he murdered Michael Servetus for being a Unitarian. And he was every life has infinite value. He happened to be a brilliant physician, discovered pulmonary, the lungs just pumping blood through the body, like discovered this, and he had him burnt alive because not that he didn't believe in Jesus, but he didn't believe in the Trinity. And he was someone also who had a favorable view of Jews. He had a favorable view of Jews, and this to the church was unbearable because Calvin was a crazy anti-Semite. And incidentally, Calvin never met a Jew in his life, which may surprise your viewers. So Calvin's lived a little bit more than a half a century. And the first half he was in France, second half in Switzerland, and Jews were in neither country because they had been expelled. So Luther met many Jews in his life and writes about it. Calvin never met a Jew because there were no Jews to be found in either of the countries he resided. And yet he developed this deep hatred and aversion toward Jews. And Severtus, combining his Unitarian views with his view that, we have some things we can learn from the Jews.
Yeah.
And that definitely contributed to his
he read every Jewish source that was probably available to him at the time, and in his writings he would quote, say, Maimonides and other sorts of Jewish figures positively, as if that they could provide insight that Christians could benefit from for understanding scripture and various other things. And in his goal to sort of reform Christianity from what it had originally been, he especially loved Philo of Alexandria. Now, current opinions of Philo of Alexandria in the Jewish community might be, what they are, but he viewed Philo as something like a Jewish source into the original philosophical context of Jesus and the New Testament, which is not an unreasonable thing for him to think, especially with the resources available to him. And you're right that he is, I think, you have to go back more than a millennium to find a Christian that has as positive of a view of Judaism as he does. And that is part of why he came to many of his theological conclusions.
This is really what's very transparent. Tanakh all over saying, I am God. There's no one else besides me. Remember, you saw no image when you heard when you saw the voice at Mount Sinai. There's no one else besides me. There's nothing, no one else besides me. And that is repeated in Tanakh over and over again. Why? Because monotheism is very troubling to the ancient world and to the atheist world as well. This is an angle I've never done on air, but I should make it. In the academic world, they very frequently, I've never spoken about this publicly, so they don't like the idea that the children of Israel, this ancient tribe going 1,000 years, were always monotheists. Because whereas today monotheism makes sense, in the ancient world it was complete nonsense, because they didn't understand that we're made of the same stuff. You and your dog share 98% of your DNA. So they didn't know what earthquakes were, they didn't know what microbiology was, they didn't know anything. So to say there was one God made no sense. See, so if really the Jews always were monotheists, so this creates a big problem, because where do they get it from? Now, the standard academic view is that the Israelites really believed in all sorts of Canaanite gods, and eventually somebody came up with this idea of monotheism, this mutation, and then it sort of took, and the Jews went with that. And there's a reason for it, because monotheism in the ancient world, the Bronze Age, made no sense. And there was no other monotheism. Judaism was it. It was the only game in town. That was it. 2,000 years ago, there was just no other monotheism. But the academic world also is like, why did anyone believe in one God? Now we know we're all made up of carbon and we're walking protoplasm, and hydrogen is the most plentiful element in the universe. But they didn't know it then. Like, it's all from the same stuff, just rearranged. So now we know there's one God, and everyone's claiming they believe in one. Like the Hindus and Zoroastrians are always after me saying, no, we're monotheists too. And I'm going, no, you're not. But whatever. But they have to do, because the science is clear. There's only two choices. Either there's one God, or you can, God forbid, believe there's no God. But polytheism is not tenable anymore. It was in the ancient world.
Yeah, sure. All right. So I want to transition into trying to be the Trinitarian's advocate, and ask you some of the sorts of questions that I'm sure that you're relatively well-versed in having to deal with these sorts of questions, but I'm still kind of curious what you have to say. And I like to think that I'm pretty good at simulating being a well-informed Trinitarian. One can only go into these sorts of battles so many times without having to learn to think like the other side does. So, I mean, first question, is probably one of the first passages in the Bible that Trinitarians will point to is Genesis 1:26. God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." And there are, other places in the Hebrew scriptures where God will occasionally speak in the sort of first person plural. And that's sort of the first and most famous one. Does that indicate some sort of divine plurality or a multi-personality within God that could foreshadow the doctrine of the Trinity?
It surprises me that Christians just don't appeal to Genesis chapter 51, where we're told that there's one God in three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and they're all one, but they're unique. Now, I'm being playful, because that would be the Trinity. We would look for something like that, like what you get in Sunday school. It doesn't exist, so they have to seize these kinds of verses. So let's be clear. They have to go for Genesis 1:26. Doesn't say a word about the Trinity. All they could do is they could try to chip away at the radical monotheism that flows throughout the Hebrew Bible. As it turns out, man is unique in more than one way. He's very good because he is binary, different than everything that was created prior to him. Man is made up, as we'll see in the following chapter, of two things. He's made up of the clay of the earth. We know now the science is that we're made up of stardust, quite literally. So it's quite literal that we're made up of the dust of the earth. But then God adds his breath in chapter 2, and he breathes into the nostrils of Adam, literally the Spirit of God. Now, that's metaphysical. I don't know exactly what that means, but I do know that every person is sacred, and human life has unique sanctity, and God dwells in every person, and only we have the ability to have a relationship with God. Without moving off on that trail, which I would enjoy, but it's not directly germane now, when God is summoning, unlike every creation prior to it, God is summoning the two features that man is created with, the earth and his breath, the Ruach Hashem, the stuff that angels are made of. Angels don't have free will. Angels are a created being. It's not in the Hebrew Bible. Jewish tradition is that angels are created on the second day. But angels are only metaphysical. Adam Harishon, the first Adam, and all of his progeny, we have two things. When we see our dog sitting, looking up at us, eating dinner as we're having a steak, we know exactly what he's thinking. How can I get a piece of that? He wants to feel loved, he wants to feel safe, and he wants to have babies. And we can relate to that completely. But no dog, no matter how much you love your pet, ever believed in God or could believe in God, even if you can talk to him. He wouldn't understand what you're talking about. So let us make man is that man has a divine spark. He's made up of the divine and the physical, and it's designed to convey to us that he is not God. In fact, that term, let us, is really only found in three places, and they're all in the same cluster of verses in the Hebrew Bible. It's here, and it's strikingly where you'd expect it to be in Genesis 3:22. After the sin, angels are called upon to guard the Garden of Eden so that man can't enter it, lest he eat from the tree of life. See, mortality entered the world, and now, whereas we're told about the tree of life in Genesis 2, there's nothing else said about it. Why? Because at that point, man would live forever. But now that man is mortal, he's going to die. Now he can't eat from the tree of life. So God says to the angel, says, if he should eat from the tree of life, he'll become like one of us. So that term us is used as a prophylactic, as a barrier to prevent man from becoming divine in any way. And then our third example, it's like GPS, worse with a triangulation of three satellites. It's precisely this way. And you have it in Genesis 11:7, where again, man has this wonderful adventure to build a tower, to make a name for himself. And God said, let us go down, again, addressing the angels, and confuse their language. So they cannot be unified in building, in becoming divine like God, but rather that they should be dispersed around the world with different languages. So actually the us is used deliberately in all three of these cases, and you won't find this language anywhere else in Tanakh. This is it. It's right here in the formidable moments of mankind, where God is saying we have to create a barrier to ensure that man does not do what eventually he does, and that is to worship man. And he'll do that. And Trinitarians, of course, are engaging in that kind of practice, which in Judaism is considered the most virulent form of idolatry. That means in Jewish thought, you asked me earlier, Trinitarian beliefs is worse than bowing down to a statue, because Trinitarians really believe in the true God. They believe in the Father. They believe in the true God, but they also believe that Jesus is God and worthy of worship. So that's the worst thing you can do. That's why in the Ten Commandments, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2 and 3, where God says, you shall have no other gods. The English is always translated before me. That's really not correct. Lo yeh l'cha Elohim achem al panai, you shall have no other gods on my face. Quite, panai means face. That prohibition precedes the prohibition of don't make statues, anything of anything, don't make graven images. That's even worse, because and it's really simple. It's easy to understand why adultery, which Trinitarian belief is. I mean, because you're really married to God. Christians really believe, Roman Catholics really believe in the Father. They believe that, in the true God. But then they also worship Jesus, and they also worship the Holy Spirit as a distinct person. So that's worse. Just as adultery is a much greater sin than fornication is, obviously. So if you just bow down to stones, it's a terrible sin. But that's not. But the Trinitarian type believes a partnership is the mother lode of bad ideas.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the interpretation of Genesis 1:26 that God is speaking in sort of a majestic plural, sort of like a "we the Queen of England" sort of thing, where there are examples in Hebrew language where you can take a singular person will take a plural to sort of intensify something or to sort of add majesty or honor and that sort of sense, like.
The proof that my explanation is the correct one is very simple. If there's the us, let us make man, really is Trinitarian, and therefore Jesus is God creating everything, then why isn't God said, let us make fish, or let us make the heavens and the earth, or let us make light? That means, why does let us, you see, so that's the problem. See, why does let us only come up with man? If there are two persons, that means there's more than one person in the Godhead, then everything should be let us. In that only man is created in the image of God, and no animal is created in the image of God, and therefore it only makes sense to. I know people use that answer. I don't think it's very satisfying, and I don't think people who say it find it satisfying. But it really. The what makes it all work is Genesis 2:7. It's so transparent what's happening here. God is taking the physical earth that all is made of, and then he's infusing it with his spirit, and we are creating the image of God. And therefore you can't kill a person. That's murder, an innocent person, but you can have chicken for dinner. So it all works, and we would expect to find, I think Trinitarians find that very unsatisfying, because we would then expect that kind of majestic we all over Tanakh, and we don't. But it really is coming up here in this way, in this fashion, right here, because this is when man is creating, and he's sort of making a life for himself. And so these are the formidable moments of creation, or else we would expect to find it everywhere else. But God is literally summoning the physical and the spiritual to to create man. Nothing else like that. So it works. Like, why not us for other things, for animals, for birds?
Sure. All right. The next question I want to ask you about is Michael Heiser was a Old Testament scholar from University of Wisconsin-Madison, who I feel like he has been extremely influential on evangelical Trinitarian apologetics in the last, say, 10, 20 years. And his sort of his books, The Invisible Realm, and sort of this divine council worldview have been really influential, especially in evangelical circles. And Dr. Tim Mackey of the Bible Project, who also stayed at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and knew Michael Heiser, is also sort of a proponent of this view. And so before I ask you about sort of two powers in heaven stuff, which is very connected to this, the first thing I want to ask you about is that Michael Heiser will often argue that there's sort of like God has a divine council of spiritual angelic beings that he sort of governs with and through. Not that he's equal to them. He's obviously unique and uncreated, and they're created. But there's sort of this spiritual, majestic, divine council that God will sometimes, talk to, make decisions with, give orders to, and they will sort of go and do his bidding. And you can see this like in the beginning of the book of Job, where God is sort of in the heavenly court and Satan walks in and asks about this person, Job. And various verses say Psalm 82, God presides in the assembly and renders judgment among the gods. And he has a series of verses that will support this view. Do you find that problematic or disagreeable, just sort of as a interpretive device on its own?
You know how many PhDs you need to come up with this kind of stuff? Yeah, this goes back. This goes back to, there's nowhere in Tanakh where an angel is anything but an agent of God. Satan, when he points out, using Michael's example, that there's this man Job who was, this is possibly the oldest book in the Bible, when he points out that there's a righteous man, but if he didn't have all the wonderful family and wealth, he might curse you. God tells him, this is what you can do and this is what you can't do. And there it is. Job comes out, even though he has horrible advice. He's given the worst advice by his wife, who's a nightmare. And I say that comfortably because women do well in the Hebrew Bible. Like God tells Abraham, listen to your wife. She knows Rebecca figured out who's the good son, who's not the good son. But you have Job. Job had a wife who said, why don't you just man up, curse God, and die? So she's giving in chapter 2, verse 9, giving him terrible, the book really goes on with all the people giving him horrible advice. But ultimately, he's victorious in the end. His family's restored. His wealth is multiplied. So it's so transparent in the examples he's given that there could be no better demonstration that God alone is sovereign, that he is the only king and there is no other. Now, there is a question that people don't ask, and that is, why did God create angels? That means, why does he need angels? And I think as kids, we just thought that God has helpers in a way. And after all, we need helpers. We can't do everything. We need people to do stuff for us, fix my car. Like God must, why are angels there? That means, why are there angels? So I think, and it's a question most people don't even think, like, now, it's a problem because there's nothing that God cannot do by himself. Whatever explanation we need messengers and assistants does not work for God, right? So there could be a number of answers to this, but the one that's so transparent is that angels, in almost all cases, are bringing messages to people who are not capable of prophecy. It's just really simple. Most people are not at the level of Moses and Miriam and Devorah. The prophets were the greatest men and women that ever lived. They were on a completely unique level where God could speak to them. And only Moses could speak to God as a man speaks to his friend. I mean, Moses was completely conscious. Even um, um, Samuel had to go into a dream state to receive prophecy. Eli sends him back, says, go back to sleep. So the foremost role of an angel is that to speak to people like Manoah and his wife, who would have a child who would grow up to be a judge in Israel, Samson. Now, it is true that when Samson's parents discover that they're going to have a child and they see an angel, they're going, we've encountered God. When Jacob is wrestling with an angel, he builds an altar, calls it a divine name, and says, I struggle with God and I won. But it's not God. And we can see that in Hosea chapter 12, verse 4, that Jacob was wrestling with an angel. It means everything is in the text. So what people are doing when they come up with all these convoluted explanations is that they're actually making it worse for themselves. It's the cover-up that always, you might be too young, but I remember Watergate very well. So an angel is there to speak to people who like Gideon, he was not capable of receiving prophecy. He was capable of encountering an angel, and we know the story, famous in Judges. So that's all, but they're not God. And no place does an angel give God an order and God follows it. Moreover, I want to just say this, and I hope that if anyone recalls anything that I've shared during our time together, please remember this. There's a rule of hermeneutics that is, it's like the two fundamental laws of thermodynamics. They're just immutable. Please listen very carefully. Most of the Bible is very clear in Tanakh, like you, God alone, are Lord. Like there's no one else besides you. Have we not one God? Have we not one Father? I mean, very clear. Now it is true, every person who studies Scripture knows there are some passages that are written, there's poetry being used, or it's not clear who it's referring, that are ambiguous. Most of the Hebrew Bible is very clear, but there are some texts that are not clear, which really require the saturation of the context to know what we're talking about. And they're not completely clear. All right, this is the rule. If you don't get this rule, then you might as well just sign out. The rule is that you always use clear passages in the Bible to interpret passages that are in the dark, that are ambiguous, that are unclear. This is it. If you do this, and incidentally, if you, the viewer watching me, and disagree with me, then just shut off the show, because nothing I'm going to say makes sense, and nothing he's going to say is going to make sense. So everything, like this is everything. This is the rule of hermeneutics, and if you don't understand this, then this is not for you. Okay? The foundation is we have 95% of the Hebrew Bible very clear. There is Ein Od Milvado, Deuteronomy 4. There is just no one else besides you. There's nothing, only God, okay? So those are clear texts. You will, my dear brothers and sisters, have ambiguous texts like Genesis 18. It's not really ambiguous. It's just the transition is not clear. And when God is taking over, it's not even clear why Abraham, well, whatever. But if you don't know Genesis 17, as an example, you won't know why Sarah is laughing, because she doesn't know that they're going to have a baby. Only Abraham is privy to that. So that's why I say sometimes you need a context. But just know this, okay? Every cult, every heresy is born out of this dark place of using ambiguous passages that are not clear, that are in the dark, or could be interpreted in many ways, and they're used to reinterpret passages that are in the light. This is everything. You don't have to know anything else but this. So all you need to do is look at the verses that display radical monotheism. Also know that you had to get it right immediately. I debated William Lane Craig, who in my view is the best Christian apologist in the English-speaking world today. In my view, I think he is a very bright fellow. And he when we debated on a Christian show, Lee Strobel was the host, so I was in unfriendly territory. He admitted that there's no reference to the Trinity anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, and it's a progressive revelation. This cannot be, because the Jews were ordered to worship one God and one God alone from the get-go. It can't be. We can learn about the Messiah later on in the Hebrew Bible, because you don't need to know about details about the Messiah during the days of Moses, because there was no king in the time of Moses. So that information could be released later. But from the get-go, you had to worship one God and one God alone. So if you know this principle, that you take passages that are clear and you use passages that are in the light to understand passages that are in the dark, never the other way around, you're not going to wind up in a cult. You'll always reject the doctrine of the Trinity. And what Trinitarians always have to do is reverse.
Yeah, even in the New Testament, Trinitarians do that same pattern. Like John 1 and Philippians 2 are perhaps two of the most unclear, ambiguous, poetic, multifaceted, hard to get your hand on passages. And you could even do it like if you just said, how many PhD theses have been written about each verse of the New Testament, right? As sort of like a metric for unclarity, because you don't get a lot of, it's hard to write a PhD thesis at your seminary about a very clear verse. You mostly get your traction by trying to make some leverage on an unclear verse. It is fascinating that Trinitarians, almost all of their favorite proof texts are directly inversely proportional to how clear they are. Or there'll be verses that there's different manuscript traditions or something like that. So they're maybe not unclear in interpretation, but they're unclear in, critical certainty of whether or not they were the original passage or not. And whereas biblical Unitarians' favorite passages are almost always the super clear ones, of which there is no manuscript discrepancies whatsoever.
Right.
And it always seems like a battle over the unclarity, and that we always have to spend our time dealing with, well, what does harpagmos mean in Philippians 2? Does it mean that something he had and didn't use, or something he didn't have and didn't take? Like et cetera, et cetera. Whereas all the clear passages in Paul is that God is one person and that Jesus is his son. So that's a common pattern that I see even in the New Testament used by Trinitarian scholars.
Right. I think many of the viewers won't know what the text you're referring to. So the text is the Carmen Christi referring to in Philippians 2:6-11.
No.
And I don't know why people are having trouble with this, because harpagmos, so he sees something. The whole point of it is Paul is saying that you should, telling his readers, be humble like Christ. Look what he did. He didn't take what belonged to him. Now, I'm a Jew. I'm not a Christian, so I don't have a favorable view of Paul. But in this text, which is probably a pre-literary creed, meaning it's older than the book is, Paul is saying that Jesus didn't take what didn't belong to him, and therefore God gave him all these things, and all these things of Isaiah 45. So that's proof that he wasn't, and he was given these things. So
he gets highly exalted. He gets given a new name, and then is later recognized with a status he didn't previously have. But all of it is to the glory of God the Father. The second half is very clear. The first half has some grammatical and vocabulary ambiguities. What does form of God really mean? What's Paul trying to say there? Good question. 1,000 different answers from 1,000 different PhD theses on that question. The second half is perfectly obvious what's going on.
Sure. Where Trinitarians weaponize the Carmen Christi is when Jesus doesn't know something. So then this is where I think they use it in the most toxic way. When Jesus doesn't know something, so then they appeal to the Carmen Christi that Jesus humbled himself, and therefore he didn't know, as though he was less divine because of his human nature, which is actually a heresy of the church. So I think the Carmen Christi is weaponized in that way, because Jesus doesn't know when the time of the end is. When he's asked, the Son doesn't know, only the Father knows. Well, how can he not know? He humbled himself. That's how I think the Carmen Christi is seized. And then when you go to John, you have, and this is going to surprise the viewers, you have the most subordinate text about Jesus. I could do nothing on my own but the one who sent me, John 5:30. I mean, you have there's eternal life, John 17, there's that God alone, there's eternal life, they may know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom thou hast sent. I mean, bang, what do you need? And I'll add one more thing, because I want to cover this. There's also, this is really, please, if you're a Christian, don't be angry at me, but this is really idiotic. I have to say it because no one says it. In the Christian Bible, the Jews are portrayed, who are not Christians, as wrong about everything. That's just so the Gospels are stories. For the viewers who don't know this, from Matthew 1 to John 21, it's basically all stories. Basically, you have a long farewell discourse in John, but it's storytelling. Okay, it's story time. And the key is that the Jews are the antagonists. Jesus, of course, is the protagonist. I'm talking about the Jews who don't believe in Jesus, and they're always wrong. So
yes, they always misunderstand, misinterpret, and are obstinate.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right. So therefore, just get this. So for instance, in the beginning of Mark, when Jesus heals the paralytic and says your sins are forgiven, and the Jews go, you're claiming to be God because only God can forgive sin. That doesn't mean that in the view of Mark, the Jews are right. No, it doesn't mean that at all. If the Jews want to stone Jesus for saying, I and the Father are one, that doesn't mean that Jesus really was God. It's what the bad Jews,
right?
And I don't know why people don't get this. It's like
I am so pleased that you brought that up. It amazes me that you can read the Christian scriptures and see what is really pretty obvious is that in many times the Jews or the Jewish leadership, or sometimes it's even Jesus' own apostles, are examples of cluelessness, confusion, and misunderstanding.
I don't know what's going on. They have no clue.
Right. And
to the end. They have
to
no
the
clue.
end, yes. And so the opponents of Jesus are examples of the opposite of what Jesus is saying.
Hello. Thank you.
Yes. And so
this conversation we're having is not held by anyone, and we're saying something that no one else talks about. This is like, the emperor has no clothes, right? The Jews are always wrong. So stop it with I'm using very strong language, and to you, Christian Trinitarian, I apologize. But it really is, if the Jews are saying that, who else, you're therefore claiming to be God because you're forgiving sin, that doesn't mean in the view of the gospel writer that the Jews are correct in their assessment. It's just the opposite. The Jews are, in the view of the gospel writers, are accusing Jesus of things he didn't do. So what are you talking about? Moreover, at the end of the book of John, in John 20, Jesus is breathing on the disciples on the first Easter Sunday, and they're then able to forgive sins. So does that make all the disciples God as well? I mean, that's how off this is. I think the reason why I see these things and others don't is not that I'm smarter than them. The reason is that I was raised an Orthodox Jew. I only read the Christian Bible as an adult. I mean, I was fairly young when I started reading the New Testament. It was 45 years ago. But it was all new to me. But it was very transparent what's happening there. It's very clear because I didn't, no one, I didn't have any bias going in. So I just saw this right away. And I was dumbfounded that others didn't see this.
And it is so bizarre on so many levels that Trinitarians use the words and understanding of Jesus's opponents, the very ones who will later try and get him, falsely tried and executed, as arguments for their own theology. And what could be a greater example of the fact that they are siding with the enemies of the very Messiah whom they claim to have as their own Lord and Savior? It's so paradoxical on so many levels.
It's a very intriguing thing that I think about a lot. As a Jew, and I faced anti-Semitism all my life, but I know many Unitarians and many Christadelphians who are Unitarians, and they're generally speaking, now this is an overgeneralization, but it really is true, that Unitarians are genuinely, in my experience, now it could be people I interact, but are just friendlier towards Jews than Trinitarians are in general. Now, it is true that today, that means in the last 2 centuries, there's Christian Zionism and dispensationalism, which has triggered a philo-Semitism for something that has nothing to do with what we're discussing. But it is clear in history that Unitarian Christians always have a favorable view of the Jew, and Trinitarian Christians, again, you'd have to set aside the dispensationalist movement of John Nelson Darby. That's something totally different, which is beyond the scope of our conversation. So that is different. But Unitarians without Darby, without Moody, without Cyrus Scofield, because that's different and it's not germane to this, a little confused as well. Unitarians always, with rare exceptions, always had a very favorable view of Jews, and Trinitarians had a pretty dark, dim view of Jewish people. Absolutely.
And you can even see the same thing in the Nicene era, is that there were Unitarian Christian bishops even within the mainstream church who had a view of the oneness of God and Jesus as a human being who gets exalted to heavenly status afterwards, but wasn't a God who incarnated and descended, but began to exist as a human being. That is a minority opinion, but it is an opinion that you can still see existing within the mainstream church, even during the Nicene era, and that you can see Athanasius try and smear his opponents by, you guys, like you Arians, who did have a much higher, I've heard you say this, people don't know how high of a Christology Arius and his friends actually had. They just thought he was a secondary god who was created, who came down, whereas Athanasius and friends thought that he was not created and that he was as divine as the Father. But when Athanasius is criticizing the Arians, he's saying, you guys are basically Jews and Unitarians. And he will use the phrase Samosatine after the Bishop Paul of Samosata, who had very similar theology to me as far as I can tell. He's basically trying to smear the Arians by being too close and too similar to Jews and Unitarians. And he will use that repeatedly as a smear. You're like a Sadducee and a Samosatine. You're like a Pharisee and
you're a Jew, which is like the worst thing you can say. Athanasius,
and there are multiple examples of that, of this, where the Unitarians, even in the early period, would seemingly have favorable opinions of Jewish standard interpretations, and then the Trinitarian, or even sometimes the Arians, would try and smear them by being too Jewish.
There's a point here I just bringing up because it's very intriguing. Like, why didn't the church have councils, ecumenical councils, to discuss whether Jesus was born of a virgin? Like, there are numerous councils. We're not even talking like the Council of Ephesus. It's just they just keep going on, and they're trying to hammer out what exactly is the nature of Jesus, second person in triune. And they can't. To this day, the Orthodox and the Catholics are battling this out. I mean, Catholics have other problems, so they're too distracted by the behavior of their priests to worry about, but they really are battling out, like, the Filioque is an example. So why don't they argue about the virgin birth? Well, the virgin birth is found in Matthew and Luke, and it's clear. The Trinity is not in the Christian Bible, so of course they're making it up as they go along, which is like, well, we started this conversation. It's man-made, and they're really the solution found in Constantinople, in Nicaea and Constantinople, is Athanasius' solution to Arius. He was a deacon in Alexandria at the time. He eventually becomes bishop. Is basically a surrender to all sides and saying, it's a grand mystery. We can't figure it out, and just you have to believe because it is orthodoxy. And he is, in the 4th century, he is the most influential, possibly the most, I think the most influential church father.
Yeah, I think that would be a fair assessment. You're right. So why are the church councils about things that are less clear instead of the things that are clear? There's no church council that debates whether or not Jesus was crucified. There's no church council that debates whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. Right? Those sorts of things were taken as settled and given. And sometimes I often feel like, why still does Trinitarian Christianity have all these sort of defense mechanisms to protect the Trinity, even to, like we already discussed earlier, to excommunicate and treat very harshly any Christian who kind of stands up for that in any sort of serious way? And I think you put more armor around your weak spots than you do around your strong spots. And that the reason why the doctrine of the Trinity is like, what's the first and foremost thing that a Christian needs to believe to be saved? Is the Trinity. What's the standard example of a Christian doctrine that if anyone denies they're not a Christian, is the Trinity, and the hammering that home. That's like the armor that's built around the soft spot of the self-inflicted wound of the Trinity in the Christian body.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Michael Heiser's Two Powers in Heaven. All right. So it sounded like that while you have no problem with the view that God has angels and that these serve his purposes, not that he needed them, but that they have a specific created role for him, for his goals and purposes, specifically communicating with people who are not otherwise filled with the spirit of prophecy. Michael Heiser will go further than just saying that there's this sort of divine council of angels that gets sometimes maybe called gods, like say in Psalm 8, or maybe a couple other places where angels might be referred to with the word Elohim, but that there is sort of this prince of the divine council who is the angel of the Lord, and that he has this special closeness to God such that he's even sort of wrapped up in the divine identity and is like a second tetragrammaton, and that sort of language. And he'll point to times like we talked about Genesis 18 earlier, where the three angels appear to Abraham, but it says that the tetragrammaton is speaking to them, so surely one of those angels must be the tetragrammaton. Or in the next chapter where the Lord rained down sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah.
He's not alive to defend himself, but he completely ignores an asnachta, an unambiguous semicolon. And it's like, I'm just watching him, and he's dead. It's not nice to speak about the dead.
Plenty of living people who support those interpretations.
I know, but there's an asnachta there. There's an unambiguous piece of grammar that's there. It's separated by a semicolon. That's the natural way. Now, some will say, but the Masoretes put it in there in the 9th century. It doesn't matter. These are such awful arguments. Moreover, these arguments are so damned because the Christian Bible argues that Jesus is above the angels. So what are you talking about? I mean, the book of Hebrews, which is a polemic against Judaism, essentially. I mean, the book of, meaning it's saying that the way things were known, this is the first verse, the way you knew in the ancient times through the prophets, but now there's a new thing, okay? And the first argument, whoever wrote the book of Hebrews is that Jesus is above the angels. And he's above Moses, and he's the high priest. I mean, that's the whole argument. So what do you even? And we're told in the book of Exodus that the chief angel that will go in front of the people of Israel will not forgive sins, but my name is in him. I mean, it's what Jesus in Christian theology forgave sins, died for people's sins, and died vicariously for man's sins. Mark 10:45, Matthew 24:28. So I don't even. It's terrible, terrible stuff. And all they can do is, you need 6 PhDs and come with something so convoluted. And basically, you're just watching, people play with the text. I just say this, look at the plain meaning of the text. And when you have clear passages, use those to interpret a text that are not clear. Isaiah is called God in Isaiah 7:10. You know that Isaiah 7:14, that famous verse, controversial verse? Well, 4 verses earlier, Isaiah is speaking to Achaz, who's a very wicked king. It doesn't say Isaiah said, it said God said, Yud Kei Vav Kei, the tetragrammaton. It says it openly. I mean, what do you need? Like what do you need? It's so explicit that when a prophet spoke, the Tanakh says that God spoke. Now, this is inconvenient because this is, in our day, this is unconventional. None of us would dare speak that way. But it's the Bible. They spoke in the name of God. And why do we need prophets? Why do we need angels? Because very few people in history were capable of prophecy, of hearing the voice of God.
Yeah, well, if I said that my phone told me that my wife will be home at 5:30, I could also say my wife told me that she will be home at 5:30. And we get it. The phone is a medium of communication from my wife to me. So did my wife tell me she'd be home at 5:30, or did my phone tell me that she'd be home at 5:30? Well, both. My wife told me through the phone that she'd be home at 5:30. and the angels and prophets are mediums of communication from God. It's not that complicated.
Right.
Yeah. And so would you say that there is a specific angel of the Lord who has some special role in the heavenly court, or is angel of the Lord just meaning whichever angel happened to be serving that purpose at that time?
We could see in the Bible, Daniel 10 and 11 as an example, which are really very connected, that the Almighty assigns for different nations, different angels that are there to guard them. Now, let's be transparent. We're talking about the metaphysical, and we're using physical terms. So, we can only, so we know that there are powers that the Almighty created that have no free agency, that are given a job to do this. Satan has no free agency. This is a distinction between Judaism and Orthodox Christianity, and that he does whatever the will of God is. Now, could Satan accuse Yehoshua in the beginning of Zechariah and God says, "Get away, Joshua is innocent here. Just put new clothes on him because his son married a non-Jew in Ezra 10." But the purpose of angels is to represent God when speaking to people, because we cannot hear prophecy. It's just that simple. Most of us can't. And actually, no one except Moses could hear the voice of God in a completely conscious state. Explicitly, the Torah says that only Moses alone. He was in my house. Everyone, all other prophets had to go into some sort of dream state in order to experience prophecy. So angels are there when necessary to engage.
Okay, so that actually brings up another good question that I had. This is sort of from my friend Bo Branson. Dr. Bo Branson is a Eastern Orthodox theologian and philosopher, and I've had him on my channel a couple times. He recently had a debate book. There was a 4 Views of the Trinity book. That was a debate between Dr. William Lane Craig, Dr. William Hasker, Dr. Bo Branson, and Dr. Dale Tuggy, Dr. Dale Tuggy being a Unitarian. And one of Dr. Branson's arguments for his doctrine of the Trinity was what he calls the theophany problem. Basically, sometimes it seems like you can see God, and sometimes it seems like you can't see God. Like even in in Exodus 33, God will say, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see my face and live." But just like 9 verses earlier, thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. So, and then there are numerous passages where seemingly God will be seen by someone. Maybe Isaiah will have a vision of the heavenly throne room, or Jacob will wrestle with an angel, but is it God? And so the way that Bo Branson answers this it's a little bit similar to Michael Heiser, but this idea that there's sort of like a visible tetragrammaton who's the pre-incarnate son, and an invisible tetragrammaton who is God the Father, and that you can call them both by the divine name, and one represents the other, but they're sort of like part of he calls it a pre-Christian Jewish binitarianism as his answer for the theophany problem. And so I'm wondering how you would address arguments like that.
It's so transparent that when the Torah says that Moses spoke to God face to face, that as a man speaks to his friend, there's a modifier. If someone ignores the modifier, then of course you won't, because God has told Moses that you can see my face and live. You could see my hind part, and we could talk about it and not talk about that. But we have explicitly, what is it that Moses really wanted to see? We can sort of go off on that, but we'll just leave that sitting there for a moment. The text is very clear that God spoke to Moses, and Moses was completely conscious when God spoke to him. And for that reason, the Torah is letter for letter what God conveyed to Moses. And Moses wrote down every letter exactly as God told him, except the last 8 passages of the Torah, according to our traditions in the Talmud, was written by Joshua, who was anointed by Moses. The prophets and writings element of Tanakh is the word of God, of course, but God conveyed this message to Isaiah, and Isaiah wrote it through his own filter. So it is holy, but nothing rises to the level of sanctity of the 5 books of Moses. That's they can't contradict each other, but Jeremiah had a very different style of writing than Isaiah did. I mean, very different styles, very transparent what's happening. So Moses is receiving direct prophecy from God in a contra state, and he's recording it, and other prophets are not. Christians are just stuck with the problem that very early church fathers are proclaiming that Jesus is God. Now, my view is that I know how that happened by reading the Christian Bible. It means you could see, in my view, as a non-Christian, it's very transparent to me that Jesus' status is being elevated from what I think Mark is an adoptionist theology to we have the highest Christology in the prologue of John. And that really is mapping onto the Greco-Roman world, where you had the great God and you had gods that were in between. And then you have Ignatius just proclaiming Jesus God, but he didn't have the intellectual requisite to work that all out, but Tertullian did. And he came with ideas that are not orthodox in Carthage. And they were, but it's easy to see how you get there. I mean, I could see easily how Jesus' status is elevated until we get to the book of John, where you don't have the Trinity. Jesus is definitely not God. I don't know if you believe that John was written by more than one author. I'm not sure what your beliefs are.
I would be fine. Like, there seems to be an epilogue to John, right? Like,
Oh,
the last,
21.
yeah,
Yeah,
the
so you
last
think
chapter.
21 is
It
a
seems
different
like
author.
the book sort of ends twice.
Right.
And I'd be fine accepting sort of a little bit of multiple authorship, but I know that some critical scholars, I feel like, chop up the Gospel of John with like finely, sharpened scissors, and that this paragraph is over here and this paragraph is this and this is an
Right.
insertion. And I find a lot of that both unconvincing and disrespectful sort of at the same time. But
Right.
I do think that John was probably written with the help of a committee and that sort of thing.
Mm.
And that there might have been sort of like an epilogue that was maybe written by either someone else or at a slightly later date by the same person or the same
Right.
group of people. And so I'm open to a little bit of flexibility on that, I'll say.
Right. Right. Yeah, that was Brown's view. But in any case, yeah, so I could see how, the church would be saying, "Oh, the idea that Jesus is God, really God in some way, seems to be very early, very
So
early." So
I'll say I think that John and Mark have the same Christology. I think that John can sometimes be maybe a little bit more on the nose or talking about some of that divine-ish sort of stuff. But like you said earlier, the Gospel of John is clearer even than the Gospel of Mark of Jesus's subordination
that's
to
right.
God and Jesus's differentiation from God, and God be there's no verse quite as clear in Mark as there is in John about the only true God being God the Father and God the Father alone. And
Right.
so
And the
but I
Father's
do,
greater than I am. Yeah.
right, the Father's great, and why do you seek to kill me, a man who's telling you the truth I heard from God, right?
Mm,
Those sorts of
right.
things. And that a lot of the supposed high Christology in John is people taking the misunderstanding of Jesus's audience literally or as the truth of the gospel, as opposed to the inversion, sort of like in that way that we discussed. But I think even, when, say, Thomas, sees the resurrected Jesus, touches him and says, "My Lord and my God," I think he's still saying it in that way that you sort of discussed earlier, that a true message and spokesperson of God can be called God. And that if you look in John 14, the last time doubting Thomas shows up in the gospel, or the most recent time that Thomas shows up in the gospel before that, like Thomas and Philip are like, just come on, Jesus, just show us the Father. We're sort of getting impatient. And Jesus says, "Haven't you been with me this so long? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. For the Father is in me and I'm in the Father." And I don't think he's saying anything other than what, a true prophet filled with the Spirit of God could say. And that it's sort of Thomas clicking at the end that he is in some sense not addressing Jesus as God, but the Father as God in and through Jesus, and realizing that the Father was in Jesus this whole time, but only in the sense that Jesus was an obedient agent, cooperative to, submissive to, and filled with the Spirit of God, doing what God told him to do. And so I think that a lot of the high Christology in John is really pretty easy to make sense of from the same Christology that you can see in Mark and the other Gospels, and that a lot of critical scholarship is dubious and not as convincing as it could be, and ignores so many of the counterexamples from the clear parts of John. What do you think of that?
I think that the doubting Thomas is part of a theme in the Christian Bible, that people are just doubting and denying Jesus, and it's almost inexplicable. Like, if you really saw Jesus raise someone else from the dead, like Lazarus in the book of John, and if you were Peter and saw the transfiguration, like, and why would anyone doubt Jesus in Matthew 28 when they went to the Galilee, and some doubted it? So that's coming up a lot too often. And that, like, what do you mean Jesus had to spend 40 days showing you signs so that proving that he is, like, what, this is 40 days? And if Jesus really appeared to them in the Galilee, what do you mean doubt? Why would you doubt it? And why would you need, and why is Peter denying? I think really, I mean, my view is that after Jesus' death, there's maybe Mary Magdalene, someone is saying that Jesus appeared to me, and people are going, I don't think so, and didn't appear to me. And I think that's how all this doubting stuff comes in. That, like, why would Thomas doubt that Jesus rose from the dead if he witnessed, Jesus doing all this stuff, raising people from the dead, Jairus' daughter. I mean, like, at that point, so it seems that it doesn't, like, they don't even know who Jesus is at the very end of the deal. When Jesus is saying, who do you think I am? No one knows. And when Peter says that he's the Christ, Jesus says, like, no one could have told you that. Like, what do you mean no one could have tried? I thought you were walking around saying that you're the Messiah. So that the idea that this was some sort of a secret, I think these stories are developed after Jesus' death to explain why people had a lot of problems with the notion that Jesus was doing miracles, that he resurrected. And it was so well understood that there were problems that people just didn't know, that these stories had to be built in and packed in. In fact, John 20 ends right after the doubting story, right after that pericope. You have the warning, you have the statement, Thomas, you had to see to believe, blessed are those who believe without seeing. So you have that warning, and then you have the end of the chapter. All this is written so that you may believe, obviously connect to the story. But I think this is all later put in earlier because, frankly, if you or I had seen somebody just talking to Elijah and Moses on some nondescript mountain, why are you running away? Why are you denying? Why are you doubting? Who's doubting? Did Jesus really appear there? Like in Luke, when Jesus appears in the Last Supper room, he's eating burnt fish. A spirit can't do that, so it's pretty transparent. That's why all this doubting stuff is in there. And that's why I think also it's a pushback against Paul, in my view. You're asking my view, which will offend Christians, no doubt. But I think Paul ultimately shapes Christian theology, but in one area he was unsuccessful, and that is conveying that Jesus' resurrected body is distinctly, strikingly different than his mortal body. Paul had a Greco-Roman view that the resurrected spirit is a spiritual body, a body but different, a seed that's no longer. And I think the Gospels here also pushing back against that, showing that it's physical and that the Pauline view is different. So my view would be obviously dramatically different than a Christian's view on this.
But sure, how about the Christological, I guess, thrust of Thomas saying, "My Lord and my God"?
I think people are working too hard at that. So let's just take the story. He now sees Jesus rose from the dead, and he goes, "My God, why is this complicated? Why does this require even a bachelor's degree? Why can't, kids can figure this out." Someone go, "My Lord, my God." You have to insert the words that you are my Lord God, creator of the universe. It's not there. It's just an X. It's very clear that, yeah, that's all. Right. It's all it is. It's just guys see this fellow who sees that Jesus is resurrected going, "My Lord, my God." That's all. It doesn't say you're my Lord and you're my God. So I don't even understand the argument. The argument is so weak in comparison to the passages we discussed earlier. The Father is greater than I am. Well, good night. Let's go home. There's nothing to talk about.
Right. So that's why I
Yeah.
say I feel like you have the tools to see that the Christology of John is really not that different from the other gospels. If
Right.
you interpret John 20:28 that way, and you know not to fall into the trap of agreeing with Jesus's opponents in the themes of misunderstanding, it seems like it only leaves the prologue of John, which, like I've said, is one of the most multi-interpretable, unclear passages in the entire New Testament. I know I could give you probably at least a dozen, plausible Unitarian interpretations alone, and about 20 Trinitarian interpretations alone. So it seems
I can give you the Jewish interpretation of it. It's really very transparent what's going on here. Oh, it's so simple what's happening here. God created the world by expressing his word. It's openly in Jewish targums. How did God create the world? Genesis 1:3. Vayomer Elohim yehi or, vayehi or. And God said, it doesn't say God made light. He said light. Vayomer Elohim yehi or, and there was light. So what this means is that God expresses the word or, and from that holy word, the world was created by his word, Psalm 33, that from it emanated light. So this is so simple. So this is an idea. It's called, in Hebrew, it's called devar, a word. In Aramaic, it's a memra. That's all. So all that. Now, John is using Philo will amp this up a bit, but the key is he's just simply saying that God expressed a word, and from that word came the Messiah. John is very intriguing for many reasons, because John will go off on a Jewish, in a kind of like Jesus will actually be called Messiah in the book of John, very strangely, both in chapter 1 and the conversation of Samaritan woman. But it's very transparent what's going on there. They're just taking an idea of that everything God created was by God expressing a word, and therefore if light could come from a word, so could the Messiah. That's all.
all right.
Yeah.
So I wanted to sort of put on my Gavin Ortland hat a little bit. It's not one of my favorite hats to wear, but I'll try and wear that for a little bit. He made a video against you, or well, not maybe that's too strong of a phrase. He made a video trying to suggest that the Trinity, while not revealed in the Jewish scriptures, is still something that is compatible with it, and even perhaps better explains it in kind of a retrospective kind of way. And he would say, I think some of his arguments were is that, well, in Genesis 2:24, when the man and the woman become one flesh, it uses the word ahad there, that same noun as one, and so one can be a plural unity. So that just because it says God is one doesn't mean there can't be plurality within the unity. What would you respond to that sort of argument?
I'd never met Gavin, but I get the sense that he's a very nice person. You just get that sense that he's a really nice fellow. That said,
No comment, but go ahead.
no, he just seems to be a nice fellow. I don't know. I've never met him. But that said, that what he said is insane, because the word one, echad, in Hebrew operates exactly the way the word O-N-E operates in the English language. It's just the context. So what they're doing is just a game. They're doing is of course, in the English language, we could say that, you and me, we're one, we're of the same purpose and so on. And you could find that in the Christian Bible in like John 17:11, where the disciples should be one as we are one. I mean, it's so clear. But he ignores, he ignores Deuteronomy 17, verse 6. Al pi shnayim edim oy shloisha edim yumas hames, according to the witness of two or three, can someone be executed. But lo yumas al pi ed echad. However, someone cannot be executed on the testimony of one witness. Well, why don't you select that? So what you're doing is the word one is a noun, just means what it sounds like, but it's the context. So if the context says there's one God, well, that means one to exclude all others. Plus you are having trouble with that. There are passages that doesn't work for the passages with God to describe using an adjective, like God is alone. That he is alone God, as I mentioned earlier, Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 6. So how does that work? Remember we talked about if there's any ambiguity, just go, how does that work for Isaiah 45, verse 5? How does it work for Isaiah 46, verse 9? There's no one besides me. So I don't know why people don't figure this out. So yes, the word one depends on the context. They have these three chairs and table make up one dinette set. Yes, so that's a compound unity. A man shall leave his father's house and cleave unto his wife, and they'll become one flesh. It's compound unity, but that doesn't help. That doesn't no way defines Deuteronomy 6:4. So why not show other verses where it says one and it's one alone? That's all. It's so simple.
All right, and so this question sort of interacts with the angel of the Lord stuff that we brought up with respect to Dr. Branson and Dr. Heiser. In Joshua 5:13 through 15, Joshua confronts the commander of the army of the Lord, and Joshua falls on his face and worships him. And the commander asks Joshua to take off his sandals, for this is holy ground. If only God is to be worshipped, then isn't this sort of commander of the army of the Lord, perhaps that same sort of angel of the Lord figure in other places being worshipped? And wouldn't he need to be God in order for that to be proper and the ground to be holy, etc.?
This is why Christian schools don't teach their children Hebrew. This is the reason why if you're a Christian, you want to learn Hebrew, you can. You have to wait till you go to university. They'll teach you ridiculous languages like Latin. I'm being sophomoric when I say that. It means, why aren't you teaching them Hebrew? It doesn't say worship anywhere. It's not there. But the pasuk says that when Joshua, he's now crossed the Jordan, and he encounters a captain of God's army, an angel. He asks first, "Who are you with?" And when he finds out that I'm here and I am a Sar Tzva Hashem, so he says, "Vayipo Yehoshua al panov," and Joshua fell on his face, panov arza v'yishtachu, and he bowed down to him. That's all. So when Joseph's brothers bowed down to Joseph, they were worshiping him. When Elijah the prophet is bowed down to by in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 7, doesn't mean he's God. Vayishtachu means bow down. Now, as Americans, we don't bow down. It's not part of our culture. No one even bows down to a president. Whether you voted for him or didn't vote for him, no one bows down. In Japan, they do. So bowing down doesn't mean worship. And to interchange bowing down, Ovadyahu is the name. Ovadyahu, same name as Obadiah, Ovadyahu bowed down to Elijah. That's 1 Kings chapter 18. He didn't worship Elijah. Joseph's brothers didn't worship Joseph. It was just a way of showing extreme reverence. So how dare you? I mean, I don't really know what people, to get a PhD in, I don't know. Maybe you can get a PhD in divinity and not take courses in Hebrew. I just don't know. I don't know. But every Orthodox Jewish child could read Hebrew like you could read a newspaper. So this is very rudimentary. It just doesn't say worship. There are ways to say worship, and this is not one of them.
Yeah, or well, the English word worship used to include the act of bowing down out of respect, but nowadays the English word worship seems to only mean the kind of reverence that you should give to God specifically. And this relates to how Christians, when they look at the New Testament, they see Jesus being bowed down to in numerous places, and they think, look, Jesus is worshiped, so therefore he must be God. But all of the time, it's proskuneo or Greek words that
Right.
are the equivalent of the sort of thing that you do out of respect and submission and honor to a king or an important person or someone above you in social standing. And if you think that Jesus is the Messiah and the eternal king of the universe, and you come to that realization, then it would be a very proper thing to give him the respect in that situation that you think that he's due. But it is not capital W worship of the kind that you give to God. I get the impression that the epistle to the Hebrews is not your favorite work of literature in human history.
It is in terms of the way it's constructed. Paul's letters are they're not hard to read, but Paul was a very temperamental fellow, and his writings are, it's not true to say it's not all over the place, but, Paul is, he's a temperamental person, and his Greek is standard, but Hebrews in terms of its elegance, and it's very well thought out, and he's making a case as a prosecutor, making a case. For the viewers, the book of Hebrews is written while the temple is standing. It's before the war, so that was composition. So it's written. I don't mean this in an anti-Semitic way. It's an anti-Jewish book, not in a conventional sense. It's an argument against Judaism. It begins by saying, look, the way we knew what was true was through the prophets. That's how it was in the old days, and now we have Jesus Christ. I don't like the New Testament because it's teaching something false, and especially it's taking nice people and they're believing that Jesus is the Messiah. I view the book of Hebrews as the best written work in the Christian Bible, the most easy to follow. It's very clear from chapter 1 to chapter 13, precisely he's not going off on in explosive things like Paul is. And when Paul is speaking the book of Romans, it's tricky because he's written to not only a mixed audience, but an audience he has never met yet. He doesn't know these people. So that's why I'm saying you can. I'm just saying folks who are believing replacement theology, reject replacement theology, Calvinists, those who are Arminian theology, they all use Romans because it can be interpreted differently. Now, of course, Christians have their way of figuring it out, but the Galatians is easy to understand because it's written to a uniform audience of non-Jews, and it's easy. But Hebrews is very easy to follow. I know exactly, whoever wrote it, I know exactly what he's doing from beginning to end. There's nothing ambiguous about the book of Hebrews. This is very offensive. There's nothing true about it. Terrible. I mean,
well, one of the things that's unambiguous in the book of Hebrews is that Jesus worships God. That Jesus
right.
is the heavenly high priest in the order of Melchizedek. He's our eternal high priest. And just as there were priests who worshiped God on earth through the tabernacle and animal sacrifices, Jesus in the heavenly high court worships God through his own sacrifice. Jesus is not worshipped anywhere in the New Testament. He is bowed to and given reverence in the same sort of way that this angel is given reverence by Joshua. But he is the worship leader of the Christians in his heavenly exalted place. The book of Hebrews, like you said, could not be clearer about its main theses. And one of its main bullet points is that Jesus is our leader of worship as high priest in the order of Melchizedek, and is not himself the object of worship, but the leader of the worship.
So let me ask you the question, even though this is your interview. So you've gotten excommunicated from churches, and a lot of Christians don't like what you believe and so on, and wish you'd stop it, shut down your channel. And I presumably, looked to the Hebrew Bible and said, wow, the Hebrew Bible is very clear about the absolute unity of God. And I'm going to, I have no doubt there are ambiguous passages in the Christian Bible. So why are you a Christian then? That means if there's such clarity in the Hebrew Bible of what the Messiah is supposed to do. And there's really very little discussion about the Messiah himself, except teaching, rebuking, judging with not by the sight of his eyes. And the world doesn't seem to have, I hope you don't mind me asking you this, because I always am mesmerized by Unitarians who I admire so much because they show such willingness to be ostracized, but so why not apply that rigorous methodology and go, the Christologies that we find in the Christian Bible just are very different than what we find Tanakh about the Messianic age.
So I was not expecting that question, but I'm supposed to always be prepared to answer that question, as Peter says. I think that probably the main reason that I'm a Christian is because I trust the testimony of the New Testament works about what Jesus said and did and what happened. And his miracles, his death, his resurrection, his appearance to the apostles after he died, I find to be credible and believable. And I don't think that what Jesus is described as being or doing is incompatible with the Hebrew scriptures statements about the Messiah. I think a lot of the disagreement between Jews who would not accept Jesus as the Messiah and Christians who do really can be at least somewhat diffused by the statement that, well, Jesus hasn't accomplished most of those things yet. And in a certain sense, from a way that a Jew might view things, Jesus is not the Messiah in the full sense yet. And that is a waiting of his second coming. But I don't think that there was anything incompatible about Jesus, what he said, what he did, what the New Testament says about him with the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures. So I appreciate, I see that you're like, wait a minute, this guy gets a lot. He's not making a lot of the mistakes.
That means right. That means you're like willing to question 95% of the Christian world. And Tanakh is very, very clear about what Mashiach will do in the Messianic age and the transformation of the world, the restoration of the Jews to the land, and nothing about him dying for anybody's sins. And in the Christian Bible, he's very much dying as a ransom, especially in Paul and Matthew and Mark, not so much in Luke. There's nothing remotely resembling this. And when you say that I trust the Christian Bible, but you're kind of begging the question, like, why? And why is that where you put the full stop? And there have been later claims of progressive revelation. I mean, it means why do you believe? If you say it just resonates with you, then I get it.
At some level, I think that faith will ultimately butt up against you can't really give a full explanation, right? I could ask you the same question of the Hebrew scriptures, and I think at some level you'll sort of ground out in a almost hard to articulate axiomatic level of trust.
Well, I don't think so. I think that the Hebrew Bible is basically my family album. And this is the experience of my nation who endured the vicissitudes of Egypt and slavery. It's my people, it's my family. It's a family history. So we don't have to take anyone's word for it. Now, I could find out more about 9/11, although I remember the day vividly. I had a flight that day. But it's part of my family history. It's entrusted to my people to convey
to your family, right? That you're sort of jumping the axiomatic trust to I trust my family and my people and my history, which I'm not criticizing that. I respect that, but I'm just sort of pointing out that you're kind of grounding out in some unquestionable level of trust.
No, because there isn't. So let me explain that, and that's a very, very important. It's a very good question because it's unlike any other religion in the world. The claim is strikingly unique, and that is it's a national revelation. That means the entire nation of Israel heard the voice of God. There's no parallel to that, and it can't be invented later. And the Torah says in Deuteronomy chapter 4, it never will happen. What other nation has heard the voice of God, seen what you've seen, and lived. Ato res ladas, verse 32, that you should know that I think back of all time it's gone past. You have been shown this that you may know. So that's why the Jews are called the witnesses of God, because the entire nation was there. Of course, I believe three angels appeared to Abraham as an article of faith. It's informed faith because I believe in the Torah, but it is faith. But the Jewish experience is unique for multiple reasons. That's totally different than anything else. We're not trusting anyone. It actually happened to my family. And the text says, if you have questions about what occurred to you in years past, ask your dad, Deuteronomy 32. So the text is instructing you to go back to your dad. Moreover, it's interesting, you're a Unitarian. The text says that if a prophet arises and tells you about a God that your fathers didn't know, so you have to put that person to death. He's speaking presumptuously in the name of the Lord. So it is a national revelation. That's the claim. And that can't be invented because I'm including the audience in on it. I can persuade you that I flew to Jerusalem yesterday or the day before by helicopter, and you might believe me. But I couldn't say that you did that too. So the text is always saying to the reader, remember, remember, remember. And that's why Isaiah 43, verse 10 could say, Atem edai nom Hashem, you are my witnesses. Moreover, Isaiah doesn't add any new commandments. As Gavin said, he said there's progressive revelation. And I was dumbfounded when he said that, because there are no new commandments in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. They would have been put to death if they articulated one new commandment. So no, Judaism stands alone as the nation experienced this.
In no way do I want to argue against what you just said. In fact, I would, strongly affirm that. And I think that we Gentile believers need to be grateful to the Jewish family story as you're describing it, and the national revelation of God to the Jewish people through history. I would completely agree with that. And in many ways, we are trusting in and benefiting from a family story that's not our own family story. And so I think that's perfectly rational and admirable and credible for you to be believing in that. And like I said, I'm sort of piggybacking on that credibility and rationality myself. But I could also say, my family's been Christian for a pretty long time. A decent amount of that was Trinitarian history, of course. But I have a funny way of feeling like, most Christians throughout time don't really actually believe in the Trinity. Like even most living Christians, they maybe get taught it, kind of give consent to it, but don't understand it. But the way that it makes sense in their own minds is actually not the doctrine of the Trinity. But, who are my first ancestors to be Christian? I don't know. I'm pretty Irish. St. Patrick got there pretty early in, say, the 4th century to Ireland. And so, that might be about the beginning of my family story connected to Christianity. But I could talk about how God's been faithful to my family and how our faith in God in connection with the Jewish story and the Christian story has been benefited, kept safe, protected, aided by God. And that I feel connected to that too. And that seems very similar to the sort of authority claim that you're making. And I think that is a big part of why I'm Christian. I mean, the short answer, why are you Christian? Well, I grew up Christian, and most people tend to believe what they get taught as a kid. And at some level, that's just as true of me as it is of you and many other people.
Which denomination were you raised in?
I was raised a Unitarian. It's a complicated story. I was raised in a small biblical Unitarian church that had broken off from, other churches slightly before I was born. And so it was a relatively independent, kind of close-knit congregation. But I also had experiences with and exposure to other churches, especially evangelical churches. And so I would often, especially as an adult, when I was in other places besides the suburbs of Chicago where I grew up, go to Trinitarian evangelical churches, and those are the ones that will tend to kick me out at some point. And so I have sort of a hybrid identity or upbringing between a biblical Unitarian church and a evangelical upbringing. Ironically, I grew up very close to Gavin Ortland, and I think that I could even imagine us having gone to some of the same youth groups or things like that. I'm not positive, but I suspect
Right.
that might be true. And so that is my story. But my mom grew up Catholic, right? They had been Catholic since St. Patrick came to Ireland. And my dad grew up a Congregationalist Christian, but then converted to biblical Unitarianism in college. And that's sort of my family legacy.
Mm.
And I would also say a big part of why I'm Christian is because I do feel like I know Jesus, as cheesy or weird as that might sound. I do feel like I have a personal relationship with him, and that has been a guiding force in my life for the better. And that how could I abandon someone who hasn't abandoned me and has done so much for me? And that isn't just in an abstract sense, it's also in a very sort of personal sense. So I think all of those things are, I could give more rational arguments, but I suspect most of the core reasons why I'm Christian are very similar to the reasons why you defended your Judaism with, is that it's part of your family history and story, and that it seems credible to you for those sorts of reasons.
But the Christian cannot say and wouldn't say that my great grandmother was there and saw Jesus raise Jairus' daughter from the dead, or make feed thousands of people with a very small amount of fish or bread. It means the Jew traces himself back to the event itself. And it's really, everyone is relying on the Jew. And in the Christian Bible, it is conveyed even by Paul, that the oracles do come from the Jewish people. And the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses, and therefore whatever they tell you, follow. And Matthew 23 is not a chapter that is favorable towards the Jews. It follows with an excoriating attack on the Jews or the Pharisees, whatever it is. It's not. So I'm sort of taking hostile witnesses. But see, the Jew is unique, in that we trace ourselves back to the events themselves, not to something 1,000 years ago. It just seems to me, I've in all my years of broadcast, I've never asked the viewer, I want you to know this. It's because I admire you so much that I did something with you that I've never done on any show with a Christian who is interviewing me. And that is, I'm so, look, I was raised as an Orthodox Jew. I've never been a Christian for a moment. But you have such a sensitivity to the truth. And in your view, the truth has to override your own personal experience, because you have to know that there are many Catholics who are transformed in their worship and veneration of Mary, and whose lives have benefited greatly from their deep connection to the saints and so on, right? You see, but you would say you do it alone, but it's just not rooted in Scripture. So whatever personal experience you have, or however it's helped your family to be a member of the Roman Catholic Church, it's not relevant, because Roman Catholicism is just not biblical. And it is. So I just say it to you. It's for my. I'm actually puzzled by people like you, truthfully, because you have such integrity to Scripture that you're willing to be, vilified by the Trinitarian world, because you're overriding whatever they're experiencing in the Trinity with what the text says. So I'm asking, that's why my thought was you're willing to do that so much, and you don't take into account the experience that Orthodox Christians have with the holy relics and so on, and Mary and all that. And that just means nothing to you about what happened in Portugal in the 20th century to thousands of people. Like, none of that makes you even blink. So that's what, why not just take it to the next level? But I really congratulate you for your integrity of being able to express that, but understand that my asking you that question comes from a deep place of admiration for you.
Well, I appreciate that. I wasn't entirely expecting to be asked that, but I am not offended or hurt in the least. And I don't know. I feel like at some level, what you're saying, I mean, you're arguing that there were national revelations to the Jewish people, say at Sinai and other times.
Right.
And how do you deal with the, Mary appearing to a bunch of people in Portugal question?
I think
That's
it's
sort of a,
nonsense. I
well,
I think it's nonsense, and
but how do you say that that's nonsense without undercutting your own people's,
because the Torah also says very clearly that if anybody will come, Deuteronomy 13, and show you, I look. First of all, we both have examined the claim, and there were many people there, and there was basically some, the sun started flickering. I mean, this is not like, this is not very persuasive stuff. It's not quite Joseph Smith, who had quite the reputation, but the Torah says in Deuteronomy 13 that if a prophet or dreamer of dreams comes and shows you signs and wonders, and then he says, follow other gods your fathers didn't know, don't keep the Torah, do not follow the words of that prophet or dreamer of dreams. I didn't say unto them, saith Lord, I'm only testing you to see if you love me. So I happen to be quite sardonic, personally. That means I think there are people who are delusional or want to believe it so badly they really hear stuff. And much of it is just, I know people who were in the Pentecostal church who felt so much pressure, they started speaking in tongues, and in retrospect, they realized what was going on. So my view is that this is, either people are self-deluded or whatever, or it's chicanery or a mix of everything. But the Torah is not as sardonic, and the Torah says, no, take it seriously. Pharaoh's magicians were able to duplicate the miracles that Moses was, and the Torah says, don't add to it, don't take away. And if you see miracles, but the messenger is saying something that is not consistent with the Torah, then don't listen to him and put him to death. And that goes to the other part of the Jewish experience, and that is that Torah is making predictions about the Jews, about our experience throughout history. We would be hated by the nations, yet they would admire our Torah. And the Torah says that one day you will come back. I will bring you back to this land, Deuteronomy 31 and the end of the book of Amos and Jeremiah. So, one of the things that made Einstein unique was that he made predictions in the early 20th century. Some of them, at the moment he expressed his ideas, could not be borne out. It would take years for scientists to use telescopes and wait for a solar eclipse. And the gold standard in Judaism is that the predictions actually come true. So here the children of Israel, here God has preserved us. He's kept his promise to the children of Israel that have been faithful to him. That's also a very unique element of the Jewish experience.
Well, I mean, and I wouldn't want to take away an inch of that. I agree with you that some collective spiritual experiences seem to be more persuasive, credible, impactful, veritable, etc., than others. And we can weigh Marian apparitions in Portugal versus the evidence of Sinai and those sorts of things. And I think that I would be right next to you with you on most of those investigations. And I just find the credibility of those who saw Jesus and followed him and bear witness to what happened to him both when he died and afterwards to be credible of that same kind. I think that the subjective and the objective do need to kind of fit together. That there is, sort of, we're testing the objectiveness of it. We're thinking about evidence and credibility and testimony and those sorts of things. But I do think it matches up with the interior experience, and that those things need to be complementary, and that it is, not entirely correct to only weigh one against the other.
Right. Yeah, but the Torah says, don't add to it nor take away from it. It means that it don't change this thing. This has to be always the case that Jewish people always have to keep the Torah. the prophecies of what the Messiah is supposed to do.
Is there any last things that you wanted to share? Any last thoughts?
I just appreciate my time with you, and I really admire you for being able to be raised as a Christian, to stand up for your Unitarian beliefs. I think that's really remarkable. And I'm very grateful for the time that we had together, and please do stay in touch. And I look forward to joining you again. So thank you. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל